And hello, everyone. Welcome to the January edition of Purpose Planet Profit, hosted by Topl and part of the Let's Talk Supply Chain family of podcasts. For those of you who are new, I'm Chris Georgian, co-founder and chief architect over at Topl. Topl exists to blend this new, exciting, deep technology that is blockchain with sustainability, with ESG, really attempting to bring more purpose, more awareness of the planet to supply chains, to new markets, things like that. If you're already a part of the community, a part of the Topl community, thank you for joining us again. If you are new here, welcome. We have a back catalog of these, so feel free to check some of those out as well after the show today. I'm joined today by Sander Reuderink, one of actually Topl's former partners turned key member of the Topl team. So very, very excited for the conversation that him and I are going to be having today. You may notice that I'm not in our usual podcast studio. I'm actually in New York at NRF, major retail show, where Topl is exhibiting with one of my previous guests, Mercado Labs, and highlighting what our joint offering is meant to be doing for the retail sector. So very exciting to kind of get to see some of those former podcast guests actually in person here in New York City when we're doing some work together. So that's very exciting. So hopefully there's not too much background noise today or anything like that, but I think we're good. Sander, thank you for joining me, and let's just.
It's a pleasure.
Excellent. So why don't you just tell me a little bit about yourself, your history, and your role at Topl?
So interestingly, I had a background in technology before I had a background in coffee. I used to work in online development for all kinds of web portals and online games. And my wife, who is Jamaican, always kept telling me about her family's coffee farm in Jamaica and how she often used to visit there as a child. And that was so interesting for me that I wanted to see it. And at one point, when her uncle and grandfather were no longer able to run the farm, I got the idea of even becoming a coffee farmer myself. But soon I found out that manual labor and growing coffee is much more difficult than what I was doing at the time. And instead, I chose
to typing.
Exactly. And instead of that, I realized that the trade was the coffee trade was a very attractive sector for me to work in. So I've worked as a coffee trader, first in Germany, in Hamburg, and later here in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, for a company called Traboka. Traboka is a supplier of mainly Ethiopian coffees for a lot of global large coffee brands, as well as some really exciting smaller specialty coffee roasters. And one thing that always annoyed me in my work as a coffee trader was that I had no insight into the amount of money that was received by the farmers who grew my coffee.
Even as a trader, you weren't able to know
even
that.
As a trader, no, because coffee follows so many different steps in a supply chain that my supplier may know how much he paid his supplier, but he doesn't know how much his supplier paid his supplier. And even if they know, how sure are we that information is reliable? Well, luckily then I walked into Topl, actually in the person of you, Chris, and we decided to do a pilot together, also working together with the Dutch NGO Fairfood, who was a partner in that project. And as you know, we started measuring the farm gate prices that were received by a number of farmers in Ethiopia. And personally, I like the product so much that I thought more companies need to have access to this. And why not help the kind people at Topl find more companies in the coffee sector?
I like that a lot. The kind people at Topl. Yeah, I remember, our first meeting. The first thing that Sander and I had to do together is I was effectively having to pitch him Topl as the right solution for Traboka, and now Sander's days is filled by pitching Topl's solution to other people. So really amazing how that has come full circle. Sander, it's also always great just to hear how, I think full circle is probably the wrong word, but how you were in the technology space initially, and then you ended up in the coffee space, and now I think we can safely say that you are in the agricultural technology space in your role at Topl. So
I have a leg in each.
Blending those.
Indeed.
Excellent. So before we get any further, I just want to remind everyone that we do have kind of the ability for you to drop in questions, and we'll be getting to those kind of sprinkled in. So if anyone has any questions, any thoughts that you want to share as the show is progressing, as always, that's always open. So do keep that in mind. So Sander, obviously, considering the fact that you even considered being a coffee farmer, you clearly have a very deep interest in the space. Maybe you can give us an update or just a high level overview of what do coffee supply chains look like today. You mentioned just how opaque they are and you don't really have much information, but maybe you could paint a picture for those who are less familiar about coffee supply chains.
So coffee is produced by around 12 million households around the world, and typically these are smallholder families, which means they grow coffee on an area that's less than 5 hectares. And for them, coffee is their cash crop, meaning that is their main source of money. And on the field, they will also grow other crops, foodstuff, typically, either for consumption or to sell at the local market as well. And what is important to know is that coffee is actually a fruit. On a coffee tree, you'll have small red berries that look a little bit like cherries, and inside each of these cherries are 2 coffee beans hidden. Now, what you may not know is that almost all of these cherries are picked by hand. So if you have a cup of coffee, there are roughly 50 beans in there, meaning 25 cherries have been picked for that by somebody by hand. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, it really is. Yeah, we don't think of it as a cherry. We think of it just as, as we get what we get, it's dark. It looks like a little bean, I think a lot of us don't even realize what it comes from. One thing I want to kind of zoom in on, Sander, is you were very particular. You said 12 million households. I think it's probably news to people just how a lot of smallholder operations work, kind of how family driven they are, and how completely inclusive it is to some of these families' lives. Maybe we could talk a little bit more about that, because we think of farming, I think, very differently, at least in the US.
Yeah, so if you have the opportunity to visit coffee farming families, and I've had the fortune to meet many of them, especially in East Africa and Indonesia. How this looks is you have a small plot of land, and typically it looks more like a forest than a coffee farm. So there are a lot of trees and there's a lot of biodiversity still going on. And coffee actually thrives when it is grown in the shade of the natural forest canopy. The metabolism of the plant is a bit slower then, so there's more time to develop all these flavors. So there's coffee trees standing on that plot of land, as well as other larger trees or other foodstuffs, and everything just grows together a little bit. And the families are not like the nuclear families that we may know here in the Netherlands or in the US. They're often much larger, multiple generations living together in a household. And the accommodations are often very basic, very simple.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of something that, as we're starting to think more and more about our supply chains, because so many of them were disrupted during the pandemic, I think a lot of us are thinking about, for the first time, where do some of these things originate? What is it actually like, in these places that the coffee or chocolate or whatever it may be is being produced? And I think it's very exciting that we're starting to ask those questions. And I think as we ask those questions, sometimes we encounter some things that we may not like, or that we may really feel the need to and feel moved to help resolve. So maybe you can speak to some of the sustainability and ethical issues that may exist in coffee supply chains and the coffee industry a bit larger.
Yeah, so according to the best research that is available, almost half of these small-scale farming households live below the poverty line, and almost a quarter live in extreme poverty, which is less than $1 a day. I think maybe that is a little bit understandable if we go back to the idea that this cup of coffee contained 25 coffee cherries that were picked by hand. Obviously, if we pay $2 or $3 for a cup, then we know that it can't be a lot of money that these people get for all their work. Now, besides the low income of coffee farmers, coffee also has a major impact on deforestation. Coffee is one of the commodities driving the most deforestation, besides soy, of course, and cattle grazing. And therefore, the carbon footprint of coffee is quite high. Most, well, it changed a bit from supply chain to supply chain, but typically what we see is that 1 kilogram of coffee produces around 5 kilograms of carbon.
Wow. And Sander, where does a lot of that carbon footprint come from? Is a lot of it from deforestation? Is it a lot from shipping, or is it just kind of a mix of all of those?
Actually, 90% of it originates at the farm level. So this can either be deforestation or the use of agricultural chemicals, which also plays a very large role, not only in coffee, but in a lot of agricultural commodities.
Interesting. And I would imagine that, because you reference kind of some of the environments that coffee thrives in, it almost seems even like that deforestation might actually become problematic for the coffee industry eventually as well, kind of like actually hurting yields.
Well, that is probably some more modern thinking on the subject. Traditionally, a farmer would just cut down the entire forest, maybe leave a few trees somewhere for shade, but very little. So yeah, we're still seeing very high amounts of deforestation.
Wow, very interesting. So, you've kind of become a bit of a thought leader in the space. You're very active writing, putting out new materials. And one of the things that you wrote, and I'm looking at a quote here, is you've said that in order for coffee to be truly poverty-free, we need to guarantee that farmers around the world are paid for the various forms of coffee they produce at or above their cost of production. Maybe you can elaborate on that and why that's even necessary, that it needs to be said, because, hopefully that should be self-evident, but if you need to say it, clearly it's not.
Well, I think the question is, what is the cost of production? And which components make up cost of production? I think one of the key components to cost of production is the cost of labor, and the value of labor should be a living wage. If somebody is earning less than a living wage from the labor that they deliver, the full cost of the product is not being paid.
Yes.
And sometimes I like to say that actually it's not us paying for our coffee, but the farmer is paying for it because he gets less than what it costs to produce. And coffee
that's
is
an interesting way of thinking about it.
Coffee is a commodity which with a lot of price fluctuations. And there have been periods that even if you don't factor in labor, farmers were simply making a loss on every bag of coffee that they sold. Luckily, currently the market is much higher. So there is the opportunity now to really let some of that extra value trickle down all the way to the farmers.
Interesting. So is that kind of just from a pricing perspective, has the market been trending, maybe over the last 20 years or something? What ways that market been trending overall? Has it been pretty stable?
No, it has moved a lot. The biggest mover, which we saw last year, was the frost in Brazil. So Brazil is the largest coffee producer in the world. They make, roughly 45% of the world's production. And Brazil grows coffee at lower altitudes and further away from the equator. This means that these regions are quite prone to frost, and the coffee tree cannot manage frost because it's evolved in the forest of Ethiopia.
And they don't get much frost there.
No, not much. So this means if there's a frost, there's a very large impact on the production of the coffee farms. And now there's a physical shortage of the coffee, and that is one of the reasons why the market has trended upwards for the last few months, luckily.
Interesting. And I think it's so amazing because you and I have obviously had a lot of these conversations, and that's where I learned that there were these frost problems in Brazil, but I don't think we hear about that as much yet, at least here in the US. It makes news every single year whenever there's like frost in Florida, where the US acquires a lot of its oranges. And I think that just really speaks to how much our information really is dependent on where the source of that information is. So, things that happen more locally to us kind of in an American supply chain or something like that, we just hear about a lot more than something further away in Brazil, even if that impact ultimately is an even bigger deal for us. Because I think we hear about
your orange juice or your coffee. What is more important for breakfast?
I'm more pleasant after I've had my coffee than just a cup of orange juice. So I think what happened in Brazil should have been bigger news.
Yeah, I agree with you on that one.
Very interesting. All right, so we've talked kind of about some of the current states, some of these ESG or these ethical and sustainable problems. What's being done to hopefully change that? And obviously now you do work for a blockchain company. How can that be a part of some of these improvements? Improving the supply chains, either in their efficiency, in their ethical production. What can be done? What is being done?
So the area that I'm personally most excited about is that of adding more trust through traceability information. And what blockchain can help us do is that as the coffee travels from hand to hand in the value chain, so from farmer to processor to exporter to importer to roaster to brand, we can ensure that the information that travels with that coffee bean is tamper free. So if a farmer at the beginning of the value chain confirms that they received, for example, 27 Ethiopian birr for a kilogram of coffee cherries, we can ensure that that information reaches the end buyer and that nobody tampered with it. Now, what I told you at the start of our conversation today is everybody can ask their supplier how much were you paid, but obviously suppliers have a vested interest in putting a higher number forward. So blockchain can really help us at that level of trust to the traceability information, and that is something I'm super excited about.
Yeah, I mean, just as there's more and more interest in these claims, more and more awareness about some of these practices, there's obviously the pressure to just report things that make people happy, and you need to make sure that it's only true claims being reported, and it's only things that are actually moving the needle that get positive attention. We have a question from Rodrigo here. My apologies if I'm misinterpreting it, but Sander, I think there's probably a question around, increasing farm gate prices. What does that do to the rest of the supply chain? Do we think there's risks in hurting demand on that? So, obviously we need to and want to raise standards for farmers, but there's probably pressure on the other side. How is that circle squared, so to speak, do you think?
Well, if you look at the amount of value that is currently captured by the farmers at the beginning of the value chain, that is just a few percentage of the retail price of a cup of coffee. So a 50% increase in the price that the farmer receives wouldn't move the needle on the price of your to-go cappuccino somewhere on the high streets.
Okay, so really what you're saying is, we could effectively double or triple the share or the price going to the farmer, and it might cost me a nickel in my latte, or maybe even less.
Yeah, and often in earlier initiatives, I mean, let's look at fair trade. We've had fair trade for 30 years now, and one of the problems was to really prove that the money arrived in the pockets of the farmers. And I think they did a great job, and they brought the subject much more to the public knowledge, the issues of low incomes of farmers. But I think that's where we can really help with blockchain.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there are few, or I think there's many first mile supply chain issues that really border onto and really commingle with issues of financial transparency, financial inclusion, and things like that. And that combination of those two things is absolutely one of the reasons that at least us over at Topl are so excited about blockchain for coffee and for similar commodities. With that, I think that kind of blends nicely into the next question that I have here, Sander, is, maybe we can walk through how some specific coffee brands are using the Topl blockchain. And one thing that it would be great to address in particular, we've got a question from David here, is how does blockchain deal with the aggregation, the disaggregation, basically, those batches coming together, those batches splitting apart along the way?
Yeah, I think that is it's a really interesting question, and also one that we internally spoke a lot about. And basically, how it works is that if a farmer harvests coffee, we create a digital representation of his or her coffee, and as it travels along the value chain, obviously it's often combined with other farmers' coffees. So it's processed in bulk, and then the digital representation of farmer A's coffee and farmer B's coffee are merged together, and they form a bigger batch. And after the container has arrived in the USA or in the Netherlands, it is split again to multiple batches and multiple cups of coffee. So you'll know 1 cup of coffee is then produced by maybe 300 small-scale farmers in the end. And if the product was processed in batch, it's impossible to say this cup is from farmer A or from farmer B, but we do know that both farmers contributed to the coffee.
Exactly. So, while the beans are being tracked either exactly in the real world or on the blockchain, we do have, on the blockchain, we call them boxes. And those boxes can take things in. Those boxes can be split apart, just like we would have, shipping containers, bags, or whatever it may be in the real world, coming together, splitting apart. Very interesting. Yeah. Okay. So, that's a little bit a high level blockchain. Obviously, Topl is, I think, definitely because of the expertise that we've been developing in the space, we've been developing kind of some specific offerings for the coffee space. Can you maybe speak to one of those things, Lattice, and how we envision that shaping up in the market?
Yeah, so a lot of the concepts that we are discussing or that we have discussed so far about blockchain are quite abstract. I mean, how does a small coffee roaster interact with a blockchain, right? How does it work? And that is why at Topl we've started work on a product called Lattice. Lattice is a traceability application for agricultural commodities. Coffee is one of the commodities of which we're launching, but also cocoa, for example. And we have a few other smaller commodities in there as well. And the idea was to really make blockchain accessible for companies that don't have their own tech stack, that don't have anything to plug in directly to the blockchain, but require an interface in the form of a nice application that they can also show to their consumers, which tells the story of the coffee and provides also the evidence behind it. And personally, what I find really important about about Lattice is the strength of the evidence behind it, and the fact that everybody can cross-check the transactions on the blockchain to check when was the data put in, how can I see that it wasn't tampered, etc.
So, Sander, I want to expand on something a little bit, because I think, especially a lot of us that maybe have not gotten to travel to some of these regions, I think there's a lot of misconceptions around how you can get data from coffee farms in Brazil or Ethiopia. What do we think the level of ability to interact with some of these platforms is at the farmer level? What needs to be done, or what can be done to make sure that you're actually getting information firsthand from the first mile?
So I think the typical mistake that tech companies like us can make is to think everybody has a smartphone. They just get a pop-up message and they confirm that they receive price X for a certain amount of coffee, right? It doesn't work like that in the 80 countries that produce coffee.
Right.
If we look at Ethiopia, for example, very few farmers have access to smartphones. Some have access to feature phones. Not everybody has access to the internet, so that's much more complicated. And we need to make sure that the tools we develop are accessible for farmers all around the world. And well, one more low-tech approach to that is text message verification, in which a farmer delivers coffee to a processor or to a middleman. Around an hour later, they receive a text message which asks them, is it true that you delivered 100 kilograms of coffee and you receive price X? Please answer yes or no. And if both the farmer and the processor confirm that a transaction took place under certain conditions, then we can assume it's true, because they have opposing interests, and they're not both going to lie about the same transaction.
Very interesting. Yeah, I think it's very much the case that we, simply because we don't conduct in the US or in the Netherlands commerce over WhatsApp or SMS, we miss the fact of just how much of agricultural business, commodity business is done in those channels. And I think that's absolutely something that technology companies need to look at and properly contextualize and ask ourselves, all right, what means of communication exist? What channels are most used and figure out a way to fit our new solutions into those, because beautiful and nice shiny solutions are great. They're much less great if no one can actually use them who you're trying to develop for.
Yeah, and I think something that maybe some of our listeners have not heard of before, but in East Africa, mobile money has been the standard for payments for many years now. And well, I know that in many countries like the US, checks are still the standard way of making payments. So
it's awful. It's awful here for all our non-US listeners. It's not fun to deal with.
So I think we also shouldn't underestimate the tech savviness of people in many coffee producing countries.
Absolutely. Just because it looks a little bit different than what we might expect doesn't mean it's not just as powerful, or in a lot of cases more powerful.
Exactly.
Yeah. So with that, Sander, what does the future look like? The adoption of technology in the coffee sector, the adoption of blockchain in the coffee sector, maybe paint us a picture a few years from now, hopefully an optimistic one.
So for a long time, I've had a dream about how the coffee sector could look 10 years from now. And this will be powered by a public permissionless blockchain, meaning a blockchain that everybody can access and everybody can read and write to. What my dream is that all transactions in coffee are also registered on the blockchain like that, and that everybody can cross-check all transactions. Is it true that this brand claims that their farmers receive price X? And that way, not only the auditors, the certification standards that currently look into transactions like that can do it, but even competitors can keep each other in check. NGOs and journalists can all dig into the data, or NGOs can make recommendations. In this region in Colombia, the farm gate price should be at a certain level, and we can check which brands are paying above it or below it. That is something that I really hope that we can move towards as a coffee industry.
That's a lot of transparency, and it's probably a lot more transparency than the coffee sector or a lot of sectors have today. How do you maybe envision pushback to that, or how can we help get some of those companies on board? It seems like a lot.
Well, on one hand, we currently have a lot of legislation, especially here in the EU, about supply chain due diligence efforts, and brands have to make sure that their supply chains are free of modern slavery or free of deforestation. So I think that's an important one. And on the other hand, it's also what consumers are asking. And it would be great if the brands listen to what their consumers ask for in terms of traceability and transparency, and hopefully ensure that everybody in the supply chain benefits from the coffee just as much as we do here drinking it at the end.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this is another trend and another realization of just voting with our wallets. And ultimately the consumer does get to set those preferences, and when consumers set preferences that are more beneficial for the first mile, I think really we can all benefit. The sector can be more sustainable. We can make sure that coffee keeps being produced, and that it keeps being produced, or maybe even starts being produced in a much more ethical way, a much more sustainable way, because otherwise it's going to go away. Otherwise it's just not going to work out. No, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, there was a commercial from a NGO here in the Netherlands a while ago, which painted a picture. Imagine a world without coffee, and it painted a world in complete chaos. And I think that's a scenario that none of us would want to see.
Yes, and I can't remember what it is, but per capita, the Dutch are up there in coffee consumption, right, Sander?
After the finish, we are now.
After the finish. Okay, so you're telling me it was a pretty powerful commercial that aired there and could really touch people out.
True.
Interesting. All right. So last question, and then a bit of a fun one, though I don't know, maybe this isn't a too heavy of a question to ask someone as knowledgeable as you. What is your favorite kind of coffee? And then I'm going to add to that, if someone's starting to just get into coffee, how do you recommend they start maybe?
Cool. My favorite coffee is always Ethiopian coffee, the washed processed coffee, which is the more subtle type. And I really like drinking it in a filter. So not in an espresso machine, not with milk, simple filter coffee, black, as long as it's freshly ground and roasted by somebody who is masterful at the art. Anyone who's trying to get into coffee, I would say, really taste different coffees and taste them brewed in a filter, because that's where you taste most of the nuances. And it doesn't have to be expensive. You don't need a lot of equipment to enjoy good coffee. Like I said earlier on, the most important thing is that it's roasted freshly, ground freshly, and that it's brewed in the proper way.
So I'm guessing you do have a coffee grinder at home. You probably don't have your own roastery yet, though. That's correct?
No, that is the roastery is not part of the plan yet, but I do have an excellent grinder. Yeah.
Wonderful. Sander, thank you so much for joining today. This has been a lot of fun. I always enjoy our conversations. I think they've been going on for about 3 years now. So I have, as always, learned a lot about the coffee space, but feel like there's still a lot more left for me to learn. One day, post-pandemic, hopefully I get to do some of this traveling to see where all this comes from. I think that'd be very fun, very exciting. So thank you
That would
again
be
for
amazing.
joining. And thank you
for
all
having me.
for listening. As always, we have a back catalog. Go find some of those. We think we've got some excellent past episodes, and we will be back here again next month to continue the conversation on technology and sustainability, and just talk more about the world we're all trying to hopefully create together. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks, Chris. Bye-bye.